Chapter 41. Mrs. Beamish's Plan. Mrs. Beamish had been sitting at the kitchen table mending a hole in one of Bert's sweaters and pausing occasionally to wipe her eyes. The Ickabog's attack on the Shoeville neighbourhood had brought back awful memories of the death of Major Beamish, and she had just been thinking about him on that last night. "Mother," said Bert in a strange voice, and he set down in front of her the tiny clawed wooden foot he had found beneath his bed. "It's part of that little toy you used to have," she said. But Mrs. Beamish couldn't bring herself to say the word Ickabog. Still staring at the carved foot, she remembered the monstrous footprints she and Bert had seen earlier that day in the soft ground around the old lady's house. Although much, much bigger, the shape of the foot was identical to this, as were the angle of the toes, scales, and long claws. Mrs. Beamish turned the little wooden foot in her trembling fingers. It was as though a door had flown open inside her mind, a door she had kept locked and barricaded for a very long time. Ever since her husband had died, Mrs. Beamish had refused to admit a single doubt or suspicion about the Ickabog. Loyal to the king and trusting in Spittleworth, she had believed the people who claimed the Ickabog wasn't real were traitors. But now uncomfortable memories she had tried to shut out came flooding in upon her. She remembered telling the scullery maid all about Mr. Dovedale's treasonous speech about the Ickabog, and seeing Cankerby listening in the shadows. She remembered how the Dovetails soon had disappeared. She remembered the little girl who had been skipping wearing one of Daisy's old dresses, and the bandoleau she claimed her brother had been given on the same day. She thought of her cousin Harold starving, and the strange absence of mail from the north that she and her neighbours had noticed in the past few months. She thought too of the sudden disappearance of Lady Eslander, which many had puzzled over. These and 100 other odd happenings added themselves together in Mrs. Beamish's mind as she gazed at the little wooden foot, and together they formed a monstrous outline that frightened her far more than the Ickabog. What had really happened to her husband up on the marsh? Why hadn't she been allowed to see his body? Horrible thoughts now tumbled down on top of each other. "The king can't know," she whispered. "He can't. He's a good man." Even if everything she believed might be wrong, Mrs. Beamish couldn't bear to give up her belief in the goodness of King Fred the Fearless. He had always been so kind to her and Bert. "I'm going to go and see the king," she said. "Now?" Bert asked, looking out into the darkness. "Tonight, while there's a chance neither of those lords are with him. He'll see me. He's always like me." "I want to come too," said Bert. "No," she said. She approached her son and put her hand on his shoulder and looked at him. "Listen, Bert. If I'm not back from the palace in an hour, you're to leave Shoeville, head north to Jeroboam, find cousin Harold, and tell him everything. Promise me you'll go if I'm not back in an hour." I will," said Bert. But mother—" He was suddenly terrified. She hugged him briefly. "You're a clever boy. Never forget you're a soldier's son as well as a pastry chef's." Mrs. Beamish walked quickly to the door and slipped on her shoes, and after one last smile at Bert, she slipped out into the night. The kitchens were dark and empty when Mrs. Beamish let herself in from the courtyard. On tiptoes she peeked around corners as she went, because she knew how Cankerby the footman liked to lurk in the shadows. She made her way slowly and carefully towards the king's private apartments, holding that little wooden foot so tightly in her hand. At last she reached the scarlet-carpeted corridor leading to Fred's rooms. She could hear laughter from behind the doors. Mrs. Beamish rightly guessed that Fred hadn't been told about the Ickabog attack on the outskirts of Shoeville, because she didn't think he would be laughing. However, somebody was clearly with the king, and she wanted to see Fred alone. As she stood there wondering what best to do, the door opened. With a gasp, Mrs. Beamish dived behind a long velvet curtain and tried to stop it swaying. Spittleworth and Flapoon were laughing and joking with the king as they bade him good night. Mrs. Beamish held her breath and tried to suck in her tummy. She heard the sound of Fred's door closing, and the two lords stopped laughing at once. "Blithering idiot," said Flapoon in a low voice. Both lords stopped talking, though. Their footsteps ceased. Mrs. Beamish was still holding her breath, and her eyes were closed, praying they hadn't noticed the bulge in the curtain. "Well, good night, Spittleworth." "Yes, you sleep well, Flapoon." Very softly, her heart beating fast, Mrs. Beamish let out her breath. It was all right. The two lords were going to bed, and yet she couldn't hear footsteps. And then so suddenly she had no time to draw breath into her lungs. The curtain was ripped back. Flapoon's large hand had closed over her mouth. The two lords dragged Mrs. Beamish out of her hiding place and down the nearest set of stairs, and while she struggled and tried to shout, she couldn't make a sound. At last they pulled her into that same blue parlour where she had once seen her dead husband. "Do not scream," Spittleworth warned her, "or the king will need a new pastry chef." He gestured to Flapoon to take his hand away from Mrs. Beamish's mouth. She took a quick gasp because she felt like fainting. "You made an outsized lump in that curtain, cook. Exactly what were you doing there, lurking so close to the king?" Mrs. Beamish might have made up a silly lie, of course. She could have pretended to want to ask King Fred what cakes he wanted tomorrow, but she knew the lords wouldn't believe her. So instead she held out the hand clutching the Ickabog foot and opened her fingers. "I know what you're up to," she said. The two lords moved closer and peered down at her palm, the perfect tiny replica of the huge foot the dark footers were using. Spittleworth and Flapoon looked at each other and then at Mrs. Beamish, and all the pastry chef could think when she saw their expression was, "Run, Bert, run." The candle on the table beside Bert had burned slowly downwards while he was watching the minute hand creep around the clock face. He told himself his mother would come home soon. She'd walk in any minute, pick up his sweater as though she'd never dropped it, and tell him what had happened when she saw the king. The minute hand seemed to speed up when Bert would have done anything to make it slow down. 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes left. Bert got to his feet and moved to the window, looked up and down the dark street, but there was no sign of his mother returning. But wait, he could see movement on the corner. For a few seconds he was sure he was about to see Mrs. Beamish step into the moonlight, and then his heart seemed to drop like a brick. It wasn't Mrs. Beamish. It was Major Roach, accompanied by 4 large members of the Ickabog Defence Brigade, all carrying torches. Bert leapt back from the window, snatched up the sweater from the table and sprinted to his bedroom. He grabbed his shoes and father's medal, forced up the bedroom window and clambered out of it, gently sliding the window down from the outside. As he dropped down into the vegetable patch, he heard Major Roach banging on the front door, and then a rough voice said, "I'll check the back." Bert threw himself flat in the earth behind a row of beetroots, smeared his fair hair with soil, and lay very still. Through his closed eyelids he saw flickering light. A soldier held his torch high in hopes of seeing Bert running away. The soldier didn't notice the earthy shape of Bert concealed beneath the beetroot leaves. "Well, he hasn't got out this way," shouted the soldier. There was a crash, and Bert knew Roach had broken down the front door. He listened to the soldiers opening cupboards and wardrobes, but Bert remained utterly still. Maybe he cleared out before his mother went to the palace. "Well, we've got to find him," growled Major Roach. "He's the son of the Ickabog's first victim. If Bert Beamish starts telling the world the monster's a lie, people will listen. Spread out and search if he can't have got far, and if you catch him, kill him. We'll work out our stories later." Bert lay completely flat and still, listening to the men running away up and down the street. And then a cool part of his brain said, "Move." He put his father's medal around his neck, pulled on his sweater and snatched up his shoes, and began to crawl through the earth until he reached a neighbouring fence, where he tunnelled out enough dirt to let him wriggle beneath it. He kept crawling until he reached a cobbled street, but he could still hear the soldiers' voices echoing through the night as they banged on doors, demanding to search houses, asking people whether they had seen Bert Beamish. He'd heard himself described as a dangerous traitor. Bert smeared some more dirt over his face, got to his feet, and crouching low darted into a dark doorway across the street. A soldier ran past, but Bert was now so filthy he was well camouflaged, and the man noticed nothing. Bert then ran barefooted from doorway to doorway, carrying his shoes, hiding in shadowy alcoves, edging ever closer to the city within the city gates. However, when he drew near, he saw a guard keeping watch, and before Bert could think up a plan, he had to slide behind a statue of King Richard the Righteous, because Roach and another soldier were approaching. "Have you seen Bert Beamish?" they shouted. "What, the pastry chef's son?" Roach seized the front of the man's uniform and shook him. "Of course the pastry chef's son. Have you let him through these gates? Tell me." "No, I haven't," said the guard. "What's the boy done to have you lot chasing him?" "He's a traitor," snarled Roach. Roach released the man, and he and his companion ran off again, their torches casting swinging pools of light on all the walls until they were swallowed once more by the darkness. Bert watched the guard straighten his uniform and shake his head. Knowing this might cost him his life, he crept out of his hiding place. The guard didn't realise anyone was beside him until he saw the whites of Bert's eyes in the moonlight, and he let out a yelp of terror. "Please," whispered Bert, "don't give me away. I need to get out of here." From beneath his sweater, he pulled his father's heavy silver medal, brushed earth from the surface, and showed the guard. I'll give you this. It's real silver if you just let me out through the gates, and don't tell anyone you've seen me. I'm not a traitor. I haven't betrayed anyone, I swear. The guard was an older man with a stiff grey beard. He considered the earth-covered Bert for a moment or two before saying, Keep your medal, son. He opened the gate just wide enough for Bert to slide through. Thank you, gasped Bert. Stick to the back roads, advised the guard, and trust no one.